Here are the highlights from day 8 in the Lindsay Clancy trial, and I'm not going to waste any time because we had a lot of witnesses to unpack. Starting off, we had Dr. Kimberly Springer. Now, she was the medical examiner for baby Callan. Now, I'm not going to get into too much detail about what their findings were because it was very consistent with how this sweet baby passed away. But the jurors were instructed, hey, do not get emotional. Kind of just be as neutral as you can, no matter how upsetting these images are. And Lindsay was audibly sobbing. She was heard throughout the entire courtroom, shaking, and just seemed like she was not okay. Next, we had pediatrician Lindsay on the stand of the 3 kids, and she said that every time that she saw them or treated them, which was basically their entire life, she did not see any red flags or any symptoms of Lindsay having postpartum, or she seemed very concerned anytime that the kids would come in for checkups or would be sick. And they talked about Cora's stomach issues on the day of the 24th, because remember, she had a checkup appointment, and so that's the pediatrician that recommended that they try Miralax/Pedialax. Then we heard from 3 daycare teachers for Cora and Dawson, and honestly, just the key points that are of note to me are that Dawson occasionally struggled during drop off, and Patrick was the one that usually dropped off Dawson and Cora. Now, towards the end of January, so on January 23rd, Cora needed to use the restroom frequently, and I believe that that's what prompted her visit the following day. There was actually a time in January as well that she said her stomach hurt and she refused to get off of like the little napping cot. And so Lindsay had to go and pick her up. And basically the teacher heard her say like, oh, like, come here, baby. Like, I'm so sorry. Let's go pick up your brother and we'll go home. Teacher Susan also did recall that Cora had mentioned that Cora's mom was in the hospital and that she missed her. Next up, we had Lindsay's coworker, Andrea, who worked with her at the labor and delivery section of the hospital as a nurse. And she really described Lindsay as just a compassionate, wonderful nurse who deeply wanted children. And if you remember, I did a video about the 75-page letters of support for Lindsay before the trial, and she was the one that was talking about how she would always be checking her phone for just like the night monitors of how the kids were sleeping, and then she would frequently like breast pump for when she had Cora and also when she had Dawson on her breaks. And she actually did confide in Andrea about how she struggled with insomnia and had brain fog, and that she just wasn't ready to return as a nurse quite yet. She did text her too and said, hey, like, let's go out to lunch one day. And Lindsay said, hey, I actually can't because I'm in an intensive treatment program. But Andrea did not realize that she was actually staying at the hospital that time. So she said that she was continuing to see a psychiatrist. So it seemed like they had a pretty close friendship. However, she did not confide in Andrea about any sort of dark, harming thoughts. Then we heard from her friend Bethany, who is a marriage and family therapist, and she testified that Lindsay was always active and engaged, and their children had a lot of the same classes together, like gymnastics and music class. And she did open up to Bethany as well, saying that she had sought after therapy and medical help, and they also did a lot of dinners together, and that she seemed pretty hopeful, although the insomnia and lack of sleep was quite a topic that they would bring up every time they'd see each other. And Lindsay said at one point, like at Cora's birthday party, the last time that she actually saw her, was that she was still not getting sleep and just felt like a zombie. Then we heard from a childhood friend of Lindsay's named Amy, and she had talked about how Lindsay opened up to her more than it looks like any of her other friends, because she did mention how the medication that she was taking was actually giving her some dark thoughts and that she was trying to taper off of that medication. And, you know, they texted a lot back and forth, but never disclosed what those dark thoughts were. And after the incident, sometime in March, a family member, I think it was Lindsay's sister, reached out to Amy and said, hey, do you want to come and visit Lindsay in the hospital that she's staying at, like the mental hospital? And so she went and visited Lindsay, and they played Uno. They talked about hobbies and mutual friends, and they never brought up the children or the discussions of her children. However, Lindsay did ask about Amy's children. Then on cross, we learned that they probably didn't bring up the children because Amy, intentionally avoided discussing that topic. She was sort of told earlier before she went to Lindsay to not discuss that. And it was awkward because they were kind of trying to dance around it, it seemed, and everyone already knew what had happened. Then we heard from Patrick's dad, Christopher Clancy, and the only really key takeaways of interest were that she was quiet at times in the late months of 2022. They knew that Lindsay was struggling, so they actually offered to take the kids overnight, but the couple ended up declining, couple being Patrick and Lindsay. And then they saw an incident where Lindsay became frustrated with Dawson at dinner, and Christopher stepped in and tried to help because Dawson just wasn't listening. And then I guess they went to mass together, and then they talked a little bit outside, and this was on cross, that they said, that they knew Lindsay was struggling and that they had a good relationship and that she was a good mother. Okay, do you remember that dinner too that Lindsay and Patrick attended a couple of days before the incident? Well, we had Kyle Carney, which was Patrick's friend, on the stand, and he talked about that dinner and how Lindsay was just more quiet than usual. Then we had a police officer on the stand, Andrew, who was an investigative witness, basically talked about the surveillance that he gathered from CVS and then the takeout, and then he later obtained Lindsay's DNA at the hospital because they noticed some possible blood on the roof shingles all the way into June. So then he talked about how he downloaded Lindsay's Facebook records, and they displayed a post that she had posted in like a parent support group, and I will put this right here. Okay, so here is the first page, just talking about Dawson when he was 19 months old and how he was a very challenging child to deal with. And here's the second page. And on cross-examination, Kevin said, you're a detective, right? And you probably do everything, go down all the rabbit holes to make sure that Lindsay was a good mom. Did you have any evidence that she wasn't? And the officer said no, and that concluded his testimony. So the jury went home, but then the attorneys had to hash out a couple of motions. Now the defense is filing a motion to allow a psychologist, an emergency physician, and a pathologist for their expert witnesses. And the state came back and said, we didn't have enough time. It came too late. And the judge has not ruled on it. However, the judge said, okay, but you have had, to the state, you've had about 4 expert witnesses that have talked about how insignificant Lindsay's injuries were. And so why can't the defense have these witnesses, just to rebut, basically? And then the state tried to say that they never claimed that Lindsay didn't attempt to actually commit, but just that it was unsuccessful, which is kind of the opposite of what they have been pushing. And then they talked about what they were going to do in closing arguments, but they stopped themselves pretty quickly. And they just said, well, we think there's a reason why, the children are no longer here, but she is. So I'm curious to know what your guys' thoughts are. And I don't know. I don't know what I think about the state.